All right, no problem. Okay, thanks very much. Where's my clicker? Here we go. Yeah, so sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not actually going to be talking about Comet today at all. This is something completely different. I'm going to be talking about a framework we're calling business critical errors. This is the work of a couple of different people, which I'll introduce in a minute, but just to explain where I'm going to go with this, I'm going to talk a little bit about, oh, gosh, too tall. Sorry, I'll try and lean in a little bit. Here we go. I'll talk about the motivation, to try and motivate the problem, what we were trying to do, talk about the framework itself and define it, and then talk about some of the applications that we have internally at Babel for this framework. So first of all, to highlight the key people involved in this project, we have in the middle here, we have Mariana Buquicchio and Madalena Gonçalves, who are two linguists that I'm very fortunate to work with at Babel. At Babel, we have this nice synergy between computer scientists and linguists, and this is a nice example of a project that was done across those two fields. So I'm very, very grateful to both of those. And of course, Alon, who you may recognize as a consultant for AMTA, and he's the VP of Language Technologies at Babel. So a bit of context. First, we'll talk about where Babel sits in the translation space. So we have kind of two different sides of the translation field, right? We have the machine-only people offering raw MT solutions, and then we have the kind of the human translation side where we have human translators. And Babel sits somewhere in the middle of the two. What's that? Oh, okay, sorry. I can try and speak louder, but that's going to deafen the people in the room. So we have the machine-only and the human translation, right? Babel services mostly the customer services industry, but the key to Babel is that we have this AI stack. We have machine translation systems, which we then combine with a community of post editors and annotators and develop content and deliver translation that is a combination, a hybrid of the two sides of the spectrum. We have our own proprietary data in-house, which is developed using our own technology and communities. And then, of course, we have this continuous learning loop where we're able to feed back to our AI stack with information that comes from our annotators and post editors. There's a bit about integrations here because we do primarily customer service work. And so we have integrations with things like Zendesk to enable translation for businesses across language barriers. We recently acquired an LSP, Linga24. So we're also now expanding into new content types, and we have a bunch of other stuff to deal with as well. And that kind of actually is part of the motivation of the problem. But I'll start with this question. What is a good translation? Because for anybody who works in the field, you know that this is a tricky question. There may be some strong opinions about what this means. But I want to highlight the fact that in terms of linguistic accuracy, you can have a translation that is 100% perfect. In terms of linguistic accuracy, the grammar can be perfect, punctuation can be perfect, you can have everything 100%. And a customer will turn around to you and say, oh, no, that's not what I want. It doesn't work for me. It's not fit for purpose. And that fit for purposeness is really the basis of this framework that I'll discuss. So I skipped a bit here, some examples. What if you have a customer who comes to you and says, I have this source, it's all in lowercase, can you please make sure the translation is also all in lowercase in whatever language it's in? Very strange requirement, but it's a real one, it can happen. Another one we have here is mixing formal pronouns with informal register. So we have, I want it to be of a kind of an informal style, but I really would like to use formal pronouns. It's a really strange request, but it's a real one. And just to highlight the divide between the two sides of the spectrum, right, is that we have on the one hand, linguistic quality. We have the idea that we can very objectively assess the quality of a translation based on certain factors. And at Babel, internally, we have a community of annotators using the multidimensional quality framework, metrics framework, which is MQM. If you'd like to know more about that, we have a tutorial coming up on Friday where we'll discuss that in more detail. But this is something that was introduced by Al Lamel as part of the Qt21 and Qt21 Launchpad projects. And it's something we're very, very fond of at Babel. It's a very, very granular framework. But if you're not familiar, specifically what it does is it provides a list of error categories, of error types for an annotator to isolate errors in a translation and be descriptive about what is wrong with the translation. So in terms of linguistic quality, that's a very, very powerful tool. And then you have the other side of things. You have the other side of the coin where you talk about utility. How fit for purpose is a particular translation? You know, is this translation actually useful to me, regardless of whether you think it's linguistically accurate? Is this something that you can talk about? And this is something that we're noticing more and more is a more important feature when talking about translation quality. It's important to us because we're built on agility, right? We have this large spectrum of content types. We have the Lingo24 stuff with this more kind of marketing, nuanced content where we're required very, very high expectation of quality, all the way down to customer service chat, where we're using raw MT to service synchronous chat in customer service, where the quality expectation is like, get the message across. We appreciate that it's MT. There's going to be some problems, but that's all right. Just get it out as good as you can. So a range of quality expectations. And we need a solution, a framework that can help us to accommodate all of that as efficiently as possible. And that's where we've defined what we're calling BCE, business critical errors. So I put a short definition up here, but I'll summarize it in a few words, right? It's basically, if you take MQM, you take a subset of error types, of error categories for MQM that you can identify as being important to a particular customer or a particular content type, right? So you ring fence a subset of error types that would otherwise render the translation unfit for purpose, okay? So there's some crossover with MQM that we're exploring. And the idea is that we can articulate the degree to which we're giving customers what they want, as opposed to what we think that they need in terms of linguistic quality. So that's it. So that's the idea of the framework, a subset of errors. So to talk a little bit about, I'll introduce how we kind of went through the creation of the framework and what kind of things we were looking for. And I'll start with some objectives. So we want this to be expressive. There's a framework that's talking about or articulating translation quality, subjective translation quality expectations. We want to be able to encapsulate as many of those as possible. We also want it to be efficient. We don't want to have to go back to annotators multiple times for different customers and try to get them to re-annotate content. We want to be able to use existing annotations, a single set of annotations, a single pass of annotations, and utilize that in a meaningful way. And then we want to be simplistic as well. We don't want to overcomplicate this. The MQM framework already has several different area categories in it. We don't want to be adding to that. So we're trying as best we can to rely on existing frameworks. And so what we did is this. So basically, through talking to customers and looking at customer complaint, we tried to figure out what was the minimal subset of errors in the MQM framework that we could ring fence and say, look, this is what customers really, really care about subjectively. And then in terms of efficiency, we decide that we do one single pass of annotations on all content. We just take those errors with the error types in them, and we just look at those error types and ring fence them as we see fit after the event. And in terms of simplicity, again, we just try and report just the count of these errors per translation, right? So we can quantify this using a metric where we just identify how many of these business critical errors we're producing for a translation. Bit of a timeline for you. We started off with some data collection. So we went out and talked to customers. We interviewed existing customers and decided with them what they thought were the errors that they really cared about. And we complemented this with some reactive feedback from customers where we looked at customer complaints. What are the things that customers complain about on a regular basis that we're getting wrong? And then from that distribution, we then kind of put a ring around it and then isolated a subset of errors per content type that we felt or we discovered were important to those particular customers. So that was the ring fencing and the grouping them. We kind of try to group them by content type. So we look at particular sets of content with particular sets of expectations and define a set of BCE errors for that for the particular content types. Implementation, we implement some tooling that we can count these errors and start communicating and articulating them to clients. And then we work with customers to collaborate these subsets, right? To figure out that we've got the right set of errors that they really, really care about. So we also, I mentioned counting these, and this is important as well, because it's a very nice way to complement the MQM score that you get with an idea of what is the subjective quality expectation that you're meeting. So we defined a metric as the number of BCE errors in a set of translations per 1,000 words over the course of a quarter, and that gives us a number to look at, right? Hopefully, for most customers, this number is 0, but in the cases that it's not, it's a way of articulating the degree to which we're not meeting expectations. Then we have this cheeky chap over here asking the obvious question, why not just weight MQM scores? If you're familiar with MQM, the framework, you'll know that there's a calculation of error categories and severities that gives you a score. You could potentially try and weight the categories within the framework and come up with a different score per client. And that is not ideal for us because where we want to isolate linguistic quality, we want a concept of linguistic quality that is universal across all customers. So we just want one MQM score. We want 80 MQM to mean 80 MQM for every customer. So I'll skip quickly across. What is the benefits of this? Well, the big benefit is the ability to prioritize, right? It allows us very easily to figure out what are the errors we should focus on when we're fixing the MT? What are the things that we're getting wrong that the customers really care about, and prioritize our error feedback loops in that way? It makes us agile in the fact that we can adapt this to different customers and different content types, so we can demonstrate that we're meeting customer specific expectation, and then we can improve some processes and tooling, which I'll talk about now. I'm going to skip this slide or skip over it very, very quickly. This is just about reporting, right? The ability to talk to customers about quality in a meaningful way and say, look, linguistically, we're doing okay, and this is the degree to which we're meeting your expectations in terms of the business critical errors that we identified for you. There's also internally, right, we can use this to train MT models and to adapt MT models to particular types of errors and to ensure that they're robust against those errors for particular customers. If we customize an MT model, we have the ability, we've implemented special test sets which evaluate accuracy on certain error types, and we can identify that a particular MT model is robust against a type of error that a customer cares about. And so that's something we have implemented internally. And I lied, I am going to talk about Comet. We also have a framework in which we evaluate Comet on its ability to rank translations based on business critical error. So where we have a particular error, like, for example, currency, we test Comet, we put it through a gauntlet, basically, of error types to make sure that Comet is good at detecting and fluctuates scores based on business critical error so that we can ensure Comet robustness there too. Also, internally at the moment, we have trained quality estimation models specifically to detect business critical error. So the idea here is that instead of predicting MQM or a score for a translation, what we're predicting is the number of business critical errors per segment. And we can use this for a bunch of purposes. We can use it for flagging translations at the very final step before they go to customers. Do we think we have any business critical error here that the customer is going to complain about? We can use that technology too. So there's a couple of applications there of BCE internally at Unbabel. Quickly to summarize before I finish, and I've sped up so I have a bit more time, I think. But the big thing I want to get out of this is that quality expectation has two dimensions to it that I think we need to keep track of, right? So we have the objective quality, which is basically what you can capture with MQM in terms of linguistic quality. And then we have the subjective. And the subjective is very, very much tied to fitness for purpose. How fit or how useful is this translation to a customer, regardless of linguistic quality? And so I introduced the business critical errors framework, which is a means of encapsulating this kind of subjective expectation and trying to, it's an effort on our part to try to give customers what they want in addition to what we think they need in terms of linguistic quality. It allows us to prioritize issue resolution so we can get very clever about which errors we think we need to be fixing first. And it also allows us to design translation solutions around this, right? So we know we have a particular translation pipeline that can avoid this particular error. Well, we'll choose that for a customer instead of something else. And then, of course, for Comet and for other automatic models, we have this now rich source of high impact data. We're encapsulating errors here that we know are going to upset customers if they appear. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, we have a couple of questions online. I'm sure we have questions in the audience, but I have failed to resolve conflict of interest as a moderator, and I will ask the first question.
Okay.
We use quite similar approach for raw MT scenarios.
Yes.
But for post-editing, and you mentioned Lingo24, which I guess does post-editing, with different approach. And we found them actually conflicting because very often the error which is critical for end user is actually a miracle for post-editor because it's so easy to spot and fix. So how do you see this interplay between Comet, which is sort of assumed to be correlated with post-editing, and BCE, which may mean nothing for a post-editor?
You're talking about the correlation with Comet in particular?
Yeah, I mean, you integrate BCE into Comet, right? But
We-
maybe for post-editor, they can easily fix, it doesn't increase time of editing, having
Sure, but
BCE.
we're also delivering raw MT solutions, right? So
Mhm.
it can be applied across a range of different scenarios. What we're doing with Comet specifically is making sure that Comet is able to fluctuate a score based, if a business critical error occurs in a translation, we want to make sure that the Comet score drops. And that's what we're doing with that particular framework, to try and make sure that Comet is robust to capturing those types of error.
Okay, thank you. So next question from the audience. We have lots of useful comments from the audience. I will not go through them. You can read them in the chat. Silvia is asking, Silvia Piccinini from eBay is asking, do you have frequency per error type? And which errors are more common, both on final translation and on the empty output?
That's a good question. I don't have numbers in front of me, but from experience, I know that things like named entity errors are very, very high up there, right? That's particularly with certain content types, especially if you're doing things like technical manuals and things like named entity error types are very, very common and something that customers really care about for sure. But I don't have numbers in front of me.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
Hi, my name is Faiza Sultan. I'm from Amazon, and you were just explaining my business case, which I was like, wow.
Yay.
Because I do need this metric and this framework for my team. We've been using MQM.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the DQF framework, the harmonized one, to improve our MQM. Our business case is raw empty, and our clients, they complain about linguistic, but we've been asking them, what's your business impact?
Yes.
Is there, we need to know what's the business, something that's not, that we identify as a linguistic issue might not be critical for your business, and vice versa. Something that we put it as a minor might be critical for business impact.
Yes.
So I would love to get your framework of the BCE.
Well,
and how is it available for use, or is it
this
just
is
for
not
clients?
something that is a tool, right? This is just a framework, it's a theoretical framework. So you
Exactly.
can do it yourself. If you take the MQM and you sit with your customers and have a look at it and show them examples of translations and say, do you like this? Is this okay for you? We think this is good for your use case. Is this, am I right? Is this fit for purpose? That's a great way to start, and it's something you can develop yourself internally. But let's talk.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk with you afterwards.
I would love to. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
So we'll be inclusive. Next question from the virtual attendees. A very practical one. Natalia Levitina asking, what TMSs do you integrate with?
That's not something I have into. Yeah, I don't have that level of practical information,
Okay.
I'm afraid. Sorry.
Then
Hi, I might have missed this, but can you give a couple of examples for business critical errors? that
Yeah,
you
for sure.
find?
Just pick on a random one, something like currency. Okay, so where or number type errors. If you imagine a technical manual that has lots of measurements in it or something like that, those types of errors for a particular customer might be really, really important. I mentioned named entity errors before as well. I mean, that's an obvious one, but for some customers, it might be more important than others, particularly in the case of like technical manuals where you're describing product parts and things, and you've got to absolutely get them right. Those kinds of things we can group into business critical error categories. You're welcome.
yeah, we have time for maybe one or two questions. Next question from the online audience, from Kirill Solovyov, Content Quo. What is your process to validate that a customer cares about a specific error category and decide to include it into the BCE?
There's a couple of different ways that we do that, right? One of them I mentioned before is talking to the customers themselves and showing them examples of errors and seeing what they say about them. The other one that I mentioned earlier is customer complaint, right? If we have particular error types that a particular customer is complaining about over and over and over again, we can group those into business critical errors as something we've identified as being particularly critical to that customer.
Thank you. And since there is a lunch, if you're not too hungry,
I'm hungry too. That's
just
fine.
Last,
No, it's fine. We can do
last question from the audience.
Yeah, that's fine.
So we always strive to meet our customer needs when it comes to translation and when it comes to pretty much our client's mission, right?
Yes.
So, and there is also always a style guide to follow. There is also a terminology that you can plug in into your model that you should be plugging into your model for override. But where do you draw the line between, for what you want to achieve between translation and transcreation?
That's a very good question. And actually sort of similarly, some of the examples I gave at the beginning of like, oh, a customer who wants all lowercase punctuation. Well, that's not an error that we can identify within the framework. It's something that we would have to maybe specifically with a customer decide on some specific instructions for annotators to capture that kind of thing. So there are exceptions and there is kind of a line that you need to draw between to allow you to kind of group these as much as possible. And we've done our best to try to create a minimal set of errors that can be applied across different customers, but you're right, there is a very, very tricky line to be drawn. We're still trying to find out where that is. And this is we just piloted this framework this year. We're still trying to test it out with customers, talk to customers and see what they think. But it's definitely something a direction that we're interested in going. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, and we have a lunch break. Bon appetit.